The Qing Dynasty was doomed to fall, or was it? Imagine a world where the Qing never collapsed. No warlord era, no communist revolution, no People's Republic of China. Instead, a powerful empire that adapted, modernized, and shaped the 20th century in ways we can barely imagine. Some say this would have led to a stronger, more advanced China. Others argue it could have made things even worse. But what if I told you the truth is far more shocking? By the end of this video, you'll see just how close China was to staying an empire, and how one decision could have changed everything. Explore this alternate history as we dive into a pivotal period that could have altered the course of the Qing Dynasty forever. To understand how the Qing could have survived, we first need to understand why they fell in the first place. By the late 19th and early 20th century, the Qing dynasty was crumbling under the weight of internal corruption, foreign intervention, and failed reforms. The once mighty empire had been humiliated by the Opium Wars, forced into unequal treaties, and devastated by uprisings like the Taiping Rebellion, which alone claimed tens of millions of lives. Then came the Boxer Rebellion, a desperate, anti-foreign uprising that backfired, bringing foreign armies straight into Beijing and forcing the Qing into even greater submission. At the same time, Japan had rapidly modernized, proving that an Asian nation could adopt Western technology and institutions while still maintaining its sovereignty. Meanwhile, China struggled with half measures, clinging to Confucian traditions while attempting to industrialize. The self-strengthening movement, a last-ditch effort to reform the military and economy, was too little, too late. Then, in 1898, Emperor Guangxu tried to push radical reforms to save the empire, but just 103 days later, his own aunt, the Empress Dowager Cixi, staged a coup, reversing nearly everything. By the time she died in 1908, the Qing were running on borrowed time. So, was there a way for the dynasty to survive? There were moments, critical turning points, where a different decision could have changed everything. And it all starts with one key question. What if the Qing had embraced true modernization? In an alternate timeline where the Qing dynasty embraced true modernization, everything changes. Let's start with the late 19th century. Instead of merely dabbling in reforms, the Qing fully commit to modernization, much like Japan during the Meiji Restoration. Imagine a scenario where Emperor Guangxu's 100 Days reform isn't crushed by Cixi, but instead, it succeeds. Radical changes sweep through China, abolishing the outdated examination system, restructuring the military, and implementing a constitutional monarchy. Foreign-educated Chinese reformers, rather than being sidelined, take leading roles in government. Western-style industries, railroads, and arsenals are expanded, not just in select regions, but nationwide. The empire transitions from a fragile, agrarian state to an industrial powerhouse. As China modernizes, its military follows suit. The Beiyang Army, once fragmented and underfunded, is transformed into a unified professional force. The impact? When Japan goes to war with China in 1894 over Korea, the Qing are not the crumbling giant history remembers. Instead, they field a well-trained, well-equipped army and navy. The First Sino-Japanese War becomes a hard-fought conflict, perhaps even one China wins. This alone prevents Japan from taking Taiwan, reshaping East Asian geopolitics. But the biggest change? A strong Qing dynasty means no power vacuum for warlords, no chaos leading to the 1911 revolution. China remains united under imperial rule, setting the stage for a completely different 20th century. But modernization alone isn't enough. To truly survive, the Qing must also deal with another existential threat, the rise of nationalism. Even with modernization, the Qing dynasty faces another challenge: nationalism. By the early 20th century, the idea of China as a nation, rather than an empire ruled by Manchus, is spreading fast. In our timeline, Sun Yat-sen and other revolutionaries capitalized on this, rallying the people against imperial rule. But in this alternate reality, the Qing take a different path. Instead of resisting nationalism, they embrace it. The dynasty reforms its identity, not as a Manchu ruling class over Han Chinese, but as the leaders of a unified, multi-ethnic Chinese nation. One way this plays out? The abolition of discriminatory policies. The Qing integrate Han Chinese elites into higher government positions, reshaping the court into a more inclusive ruling body. They also promote a shared national identity, one that isn't just Manchu, but Chinese, in a broader sense. Think about how the Ottomans tried, and failed, with Ottomanism. But in this scenario, the Qing succeed by adapting early and decisively. Now, imagine the impact. Nationalist uprisings, like the ones that led to the 1911 revolution, never reach critical mass. Sun Yat-sen, instead of overthrowing the Qing, is brought into the fold, perhaps as a key reformist within the government. Instead of collapsing into warlordism and civil strife, China enters the 20th century as a politically stable empire, evolving into a constitutional monarchy. And with a strong, unified China, another major shift takes place: its role in global conflicts. With a stable, modernizing Qing Empire entering the 20th century, China is no longer the sick man of Asia. Instead of being carved up by foreign powers, it stands as a serious player on the global stage. And this changes everything, especially when it comes to World War I and beyond. In our timeline, China was largely sidelined during WWI, only joining the Allies in 1917 and contributing mostly laborers rather than troops. But in this alternate reality, a unified and industrializing Qing Dynasty has options. It could actively participate in the war, supplying troops and resources in exchange for territorial concessions. Imagine a scenario where Germany's Qingdao colony is taken not by Japan, but by China itself, shifting the balance of power in East Asia. This also means Japan faces a much stronger rival much earlier. No second Sino-Japanese War as we know it. No easy conquest of Manchuria in 1931. Instead of an isolated Republic of China struggling to fight off Imperial Japan, we have a powerful, modernized Qing dynasty capable of resisting Japanese expansion, maybe even deterring it altogether. And here's where things get really interesting. If Japan never invades China, World War II in the Pacific plays out very differently. The US might not impose crippling sanctions on Japan, delaying or even preventing the attack on Pearl Harbor. No Pearl Harbor means no immediate US entry into the war, giving Nazi Germany more time to consolidate power in Europe. The domino effect is massive. So, instead of a fractured China consumed by internal struggles, we have a stable, industrialized Qing Empire playing a decisive role in world affairs. And by the time we reach the Cold War, China isn't a communist superpower. It's something entirely different. But that raises a big question. What happens to Mao, communism, and the entire balance of the 20th century? Now, let's talk about the Cold War, because without the fall of the Qing, China's entire trajectory shifts, and that has massive implications for the global balance of power. In our timeline, Mao Zedong's communist revolution reshaped China into a socialist state, leading to events like the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and decades of US-China tensions. But with a stable Qing dynasty still in power, there's no Chinese civil war, no communist takeover, no Maoist policies that led to tens of millions of deaths. So, what happens instead? Well, one possibility is that the Qing, now modernized and reforming under global pressure, follows a path similar to Japan's Meiji Restoration, embracing controlled industrialization while maintaining imperial rule. That means by the mid-20th century, China isn't a communist stronghold, but a constitutional monarchy with a booming economy. And here's where things get really wild. Without a communist China, the Soviet Union loses a major Cold War ally. The Korean War? Completely different. Vietnam? Maybe it never escalates into a full-scale war. The entire East-West divide is shaken to its core. Imagine a Cold War where the US isn't locked in a decades-long struggle with a hostile Beijing, but instead sees China as an economic and diplomatic counterweight to Soviet influence. This also means Taiwan's situation looks very different. In our reality, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists fled to Taiwan after losing to the communists. But if there's no communist takeover, there's no retreat. Taiwan might still be part of a unified China today, or it could develop as an autonomous region under a Qing constitutional government. And perhaps the biggest shift of all, without the ideological battle between communist China and the capitalist West, globalization as we know it takes a completely different path. China's rise as a global economic power happens much earlier, and instead of an authoritarian government managing a capitalist economy, we could be looking at a freer, more democratic China shaping the 21st century. So, in this alternate world, the modern superpower rivalry we know, China versus the US, might not even exist. Instead, we'd have a multipolar world with China as an early economic giant, the Soviet Union weaker, and the US navigating a totally different Cold War landscape. But that brings us to the biggest question of all. If this happens, what does the modern world actually look like? But beyond politics and economics, what about culture? What about the very identity of China and its people? If the Qing dynasty never fell, Chinese society might look drastically different today. the cultural revolution that reshaped China in the 20th century, abolishing old traditions, promoting state-controlled ideology, and redefining national identity, may never have happened. Traditional Confucian values could still dominate, shaping education, family structure, and governance. The imperial examination system, or a modern version of it, might continue to be the primary path to power. Mandarin Chinese as we know it today? It might still be competing with Manchu as the court's official language, keeping alive a culture that all but disappeared after the fall of the Qing. Fashion, art, and literature could also take a different path. Instead of the communist-driven emphasis on collective progress, maybe we see an even stronger preservation of ancient Chinese artistic traditions. Imagine an alternate 21st century where Qing-style architecture still defines Beijing, where traditional Hanfu and Manchu robes are everyday wear, and where classical Chinese poetry remains a dominant form of literary expression. But there's also a downside. Without the upheavals of the 20th century, would China have undergone the same push for social change? Would women have gained more rights as quickly? Would social mobility have remained as rigid as it was under imperial rule? Maybe without revolution, without forced modernization, certain aspects of society would still be stuck in the past. The Qing surviving isn't just about political power. It's about how people live, what they value, and how they see themselves. A China where the dynasty never falls isn't just a different government. It's a completely different culture. So, after everything we've broken down, how does this alternate timeline shape the modern world? What kind of future are we looking at? For starters, China is likely one of the most dominant economic powers much earlier than in our timeline. Instead of the rise of China being a late 20th and 21st century phenomenon, it could have happened decades earlier, with the Qing Dynasty overseeing a stable, industrialized, and globally integrated economy. That means modern supply chains, global trade, and technological development might all look completely different today. But it's not just China. Think about the entire balance of power. Without Communist China as a Cold War player, the Soviet Union could have collapsed even sooner, maybe even before the 1990s. With no Maoist influence, maybe socialist movements around the world don't gain as much traction, shifting the political landscape of Asia, Africa, and Latin America in unpredictable ways. And then there's the question of democracy. In our timeline, the Qing's collapse led to decades of instability, war, and eventually a centralized authoritarian state. But if the Qing had successfully modernized and reformed, we might see a constitutional monarchy, similar to Japan or the UK, where democratic institutions evolve alongside the imperial system. That means today's China could be a political hybrid, an advanced open market economy with a constitutional government rather than a one-party state. Technology and innovation? Completely different. With a stable government and strong institutions, China's advancements in science, industry, and infrastructure could have led the world earlier than the US. Instead of Silicon Valley, maybe the tech revolution starts in Beijing or Shanghai. Maybe the first person on the moon isn't an American, but a Chinese astronaut. And what about global culture? A powerful, reformed Qing China would mean a much earlier spread of Chinese soft power. Movies, music, fashion, philosophy, long before Hollywood and Western pop culture. Chinese language and traditions might be far more embedded in global culture today than they already are. So, in this alternate world, the 21st century might not be about China rising. It might be about China leading, in a way that changes everything from global politics to economics to the very culture we consume. But one last question remains. If the Qing dynasty had survived and thrived, would the world actually be better off? Or would a different set of problems have emerged? So, after everything we've explored, the modernization of the Qing dynasty, the ripple effects on world politics, the transformation of global power structures, one big question still remains. Would this actually be a better world, or just a different one? On one hand, a stable and reformed Qing empire could have meant a more peaceful China. No warlords, no civil wars, no cultural revolution. Millions of lives could have been spared, and China's economic rise might have happened much earlier, reshaping the entire modern world. But on the other hand, maybe that stability comes at a cost. A Qing-led China might have evolved into a rigid conservative monarchy, holding on to power for the sake of tradition rather than progress. Maybe without the struggles of the 20th century, there's no drive for reform, no explosive economic boom, and no technological breakthroughs that define our modern age. Maybe China remains a global power, but never truly leads. And then, there's the wild card, human nature. No matter how strong an empire seems, history shows that all ruling systems eventually crumble. Maybe a reformed Qing survives the 20th century. But does it survive the 21st? Does it withstand the pressures of globalization, democracy, and the changing expectations of its people? The truth is, no alternate history is perfect. Every timeline comes with its own challenges, its own consequences, and its own what-ifs. But one thing's for sure, if the Qing Dynasty never fell, the world we know today would be almost unrecognizable. So, would you rather live in that world, or this one? Do you think a surviving Qing dynasty would have made the world better or worse? Would China still rise as a superpower, or would it lag behind? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's debate it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into alternative history, make sure to like and subscribe for more thought-provoking scenarios. And if you want to see a what-if on another empire, maybe the Romanovs never fell, or the Ottoman Empire still ruled the Middle East? Let me know below. Can't wait to hear what you think. See you in the next one.